Welcome to Chapter 11. In Chapter 11, we are talking about mental health and community mental health, and I sure hope I know something about this because this was actually what I specialized in when I was in grad school, and I worked 5 years, so we'll see what I know about this. After we're done with the chapter, we should be able to define mental health and mental disorders and explain the prevalence of mental disorders in the United States, cite specific examples of the causes of mental disorders, briefly trace the history of mental health care, define the term deinstitutionalization, list and discuss the forces that brought it about, define stress and explain its relationships to physical and mental health, describe community mental health centers as alternatives to state psychiatric hospitals, identify the major problems faced by people with mental illness who are homeless, describe the challenges facing law enforcement personnel when dealing with community residents who are struggling with acute symptoms of severe mental illness. Let's define some terms here on that last one before we move on. Who are struggling with acute symptoms. That means they're right now, they're occurring in the moment, and these people have severe mental illness, meaning maybe they are hallucinating, maybe they don't understand what's going on around them, lots of confusion. They may be acting like somebody who is violent or somebody who has bad intentions as opposed to somebody who is sick or ill. All right, list and briefly describe the basic approaches to treating mental disorders and other ways to support people. Define self-help groups, give examples, and explain how they are helpful to their members. And explain the federal government's role in supporting healthcare services to this population. All right, let's start. But let me start out by saying there's a lot of slides, and so I'm going to try to move through these a little bit quicker than I normally do. So let's start by talking about the prevalence of mental illness. It is the leading cause of disability in North America and Europe. Interesting, because those are pretty rich places. About 20% of American adults have diagnosable mental disorders within a given year. That means one out of every 5 of us on a given year could be diagnosed with a mental disorder that year. So it's pretty prevalent. Obviously, that's different than having a disability, right? Only 43% of people receive treatment. That means most people do not receive treatment, or they don't receive treatment through their doctors, for instance. They may be self-medicating, which doesn't usually go well. They may be self-medicating with things like alcohol and drugs, or some people give their children Mountain Dew if they have ADHD, thinking that's going to help them, and maybe it does with some people. The needs of people with mental illness is diverse, right? People's situations are different, their needs are different, and some of them are going to need therapeutic interventions like medication, and some of them are going to need social services such as stable housing, food help. All right, here is a chart that just shows how much mental illness there is that causes disability as compared to other things. Causes of disability for all ages. United States, Canada, and Western Europe. Western Europe is, again, those are the richer countries like France and Spain. I think the UK is in there too. So anyway, as you can see, mental illness and alcohol and drug disorders lead the pack. All right, this is a model, a way of thinking about stress. And so in this, you have the stage of alarm where there is a stressful situation and the person's body is beginning to respond to that stress by increasing its heart rate, hormonal changes occur, breathing changes, and then you have a stage of resistance where our body is resisting the stress, but notice that it's above the normal level of resistance. And so the person is fighting it the best they can. They're staying up late to accomplish tasks. They are putting their best willpower forward, but typically this can only last so long before their body goes into a stage of exhaustion. And so maybe this is where mental illness shows up at this point in time, or maybe this is where chronic disease shows up, like ulcers or high blood pressure. It also could be the place where other disorders show up. I mean, most diseases have stress as a cause, as a part of it. So, all right, let's define some terms here. What is mental health? Emotional and social well-being, how somebody is feeling and how they are interacting with other people. Are they going to work? Are they able to spend time with friends? Are they feeling comfortable while they are with other people? That's related to mental health. A mental disorder are a health condition characterized by alterations in thinking, mood, or behavior associated with distress or impaired functioning. Right? So their thinking has changed, or their mood has changed, or they're doing something that is because of, or at least associated with, some sort of distress or something they're not able to do. A mental illness are all the diagnosable mental disorders. So mental illness is where you take a collection of feelings or moods or behaviors and kind of group them together, and you're saying this is what depression looks like, this is what schizophrenia looks like, or this is how we're going to take these collection of symptoms and put it under the category of this illness, whether that's bipolar or schizophrenia. We're going to step back for this slide and say, what are things that people with good mental health are able to do? Right? So one of the things that they're able to do is to function under adversity. Your boss gives you a hard time for something that really wasn't under your control. Are you able to function under that? Are you able to adapt to changes around you? Your best friend moves away. You're able to continue to change and adapt and maybe say, well, maybe we're going to spend more time on the phone. Maybe I'm going to reach out to friends that I haven't connected with in a while as sort of a substitute for the socialization that I would have done with my friend. Can I maintain control over my feelings of anxiety? Or do they feel like they are the ones controlling me? Do I find satisfaction in helping other people? Can I feel like I am secure enough to not just take care of myself, but I have enough to give to other people? Can I curb the amount of hatred that I have and the amount of guilt that I feel, as opposed to allowing those feelings to overwhelm me so that I end up running away from them, and now I'm beginning to show symptoms of mental illness because I can't go certain places in my mind. I have dysfunction because of that. And then loving other people, right? Because I have enough self-respect, I have enough love inside of me that I don't need to just focus on myself, and what I can get from other people, but I have enough to give other people, but I don't have to receive from them in order to give. All right, well, let's talk about how mental disorders are classified. And again, it is a collection of symptoms that what makes a classification of a mental disorder. So the most popular book is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. They produce one every, I don't know, we'll say 10 years. We're currently on our 5th edition, which is sometimes abbreviated as the DSM-5. And it classifies disorders based upon behavioral signs, things that people are doing, rather than definitive tests. You don't do a brain scan. You don't pull out a measuring stick or tap somebody's leg in order to find out if they have a mental disorder, which makes it somewhat subjective, and there are criticisms about the way we diagnose mental disorders. You could do a Google search or a YouTube search about, mental illness, and you're going to find people who are have really given a lot of thought to the idea that mental disorders are make-believe, because there's not a definitive test. There are instruments, there are ways of measuring them, but it's not like a broken bone. When you have a broken bone, it's kind of obvious, like, oh, I can see it. The bone is supposed to go this way and it's going that way. So clearly there's some sort of diagnosable problem here that needs to be fixed. But with mental disorders, you can't see it in our brains. You can see the behaviors, but again, that's sort of it's harder to measure that stuff. So anyway, it is a challenge to diagnose because of things like what I mentioned earlier, and also comorbidity. Comorbidity is where somebody has multiple things going on. Usually it refers to substance abuse or alcohol abuse plus mental illness. So for instance, if the person is feeling very hyperactive, then how do you know if it is a mental health issue or if it's the drugs that they took earlier in the day? So that becomes difficult, and typically the person has to sober up before they can be diagnosed. And then a lack of cultural confidence. Sometimes people act hyper, they talk fast because that's the way they grew up, and that's what is expected in that culture. New York City would be an example of a place where they just talk fast and they move fast. All right, what are causes of mental disorders? You have a lot of causes here. So it's tough to know on any specific thing what is the cause, but some possible things would include prenatal care or poor prenatal care, prenatal environment. And why is this causing it? Well, this is where the brain is developing, where somebody is learning about emotions. And so if there are traumatic things occurring, it's altering the way the brain functions. Genetics. There's a strong connection between one generation and the next. Environmental factors, brain functioning impairments. If you watch medication commercials, you oftentimes see neurons firing, and that's the issue, where the neurons are releasing too much of the brain chemicals or too little of the brain chemicals, and so the medication comes in there and alters the way that brain functions. Substance abuse, maladaptive family functioning, and stress. Right? PTSD has been a disorder that's gotten a lot of attention in the last, decade or two, due to the prevalence of people who were involved in the military coming back and showing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, otherwise abbreviated as PTSD. It is marked by, it's an anxiety disorder, and there is a lot of stress that is occurring usually in the environment, like a war or domestic violence, and that is causing psychological and physiological response, normal responses. When you're in a war zone, when you're in a domestic violence situation, it's normal for our body to react to that stress, right? Fight or flight reactions, where our body is changing, and it's pumping lots of blood to our muscles, and lots of adrenaline is flowing, allowing us to either run away or to fight in that situation. And so that's sort of normal and good in those situations. The issue is when that person is removed from that dangerous situation back into civilian life or away from the abuser, and their body is still reacting in a way that it was when it was in that stressful situation. So the person is reliving that experience, even though they may be on the other side of the world. In their mind, they're still in that combat zone, or the person who is abusing them could have passed away, but they're waking up, and they're thinking that they're still next to them, getting ready to hurt them. And so this is very painful and difficult for people who are experiencing this. And fortunately, there's been a lot of research and treatments that have been developed to help these people suffering with it. Let's talk about substance abuse and suicide. Unfortunately, there has been an uptick in the number of people who are middle-aged and white who are dying due to suicide and substance abuse. I feel like substance abuse could mostly be explained by the rising number of people who have opiate addictions. While suicide is not a mental illness, there's no suicidal, there's no mental illness that is just suicide. There's depression that can be characterized by suicidal ideations, but just suicidal thoughts or even actions alone is not suicide, or is not a mental illness. Unfortunately, the suicide rates are rising in the United States, especially among young adults. So I've got a few slides here that try to demonstrate what the suicide rates have been doing. Realize that for every one person that completes a suicide, there have been 4 people who are hospitalized for suicidal attempts, 8 people who have visited an emergency department related to suicide, 27 people report that they have attempted suicide, and 275 people who have seriously considered suicide. So takes people's words seriously and their actions seriously. Suicidal ideation is not something that can't be cured. Many times people are thinking about suicide or even attempting suicide, and they may only do it one time. And so it's not like a hopeless situation. Like if they want to do it, they're going to do it. That's not true at all. This slide looks at who commits suicide based upon race, and as you can see here, non-Hispanic, Indian, and Native Alaskans have by far the highest suicide rate, followed by non-Hispanic whites. All right, the people with the lowest suicide rate are blacks, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic Asians. The suicide rate in children has unfortunately been going up. If you can compare it to the year 2000, there were 4,294 suicide deaths, whereas in 2018 there were 6,807 suicide deaths. Firearms are used in the majority of suicides. Firearms are most lethal. If you compare guns to, say, somebody slitting their wrist or taking pills, firearms are just, there's more lethal. Therefore, I think that's one of the reasons why they are used in more than half of suicides. All right. And while we said that there's been an increase in the number of young people who have been taking their own life, that's this group right here. While that's true, still the largest number of suicides are done by people who are 85 and older. And all right, well, let's talk quickly about the history of mental health care in the United States. And I've got some good news here. We have gotten much better at treating mental health than we used to in the past. Overall, the history is characterized by periods of enthusiastic reform where people want to spend money, they want to try out new ideas, followed by periods where we're like, well, there's not a whole lot we can do about it, so let's not fund it as much. All right, before World War II, during colonial times, and probably for most of history, people with mental illness were cared for by their families, or if the family was well off enough, they would have a private caretaker, or maybe someone in the family just wanted to do that job, and maybe they didn't have other things to do, and so they were able to kind of look after the family member who had a mental illness. Institutionalization starts in the 18th century, so that would be the 1700s here in the United States. And institutionalization is where somebody is being removed from their home, from their community, and they are put in a special place. I think of it like a campus or a hospital where they're removed from the rest of society. Kind of similar in some ways to a jail, but much better, especially in the beginning when we first started doing it. But ironically, jails are going to come up here in a second as they become the kind of default place for people mentally ill who are institutionalized. So the population growth in the United States, where many more people, immigrant families who were coming from Europe, were settling in the cities, and that made it difficult for people to be cared for by the families. If you're in a rural area and you're in a farm and there's a lot of space, it is easier to care for somebody than if you're in a crowded city where both members of the family have to work, and they have to work outside the home, and they may not be able to bring that family member with them. As more and more people went to institutions, it became more and more difficult for institutions to kind of stick to the ideals that they had about treating people well and giving them fresh air and kind of a new start. And so harsh treatments where, there was beliefs around, like, if you spin people around very quickly, it'll kind of spin the illness out of them. And so you have a lot of harsh treatments and unpleasant things happening. The moral treatment era begins in the 1792, and it's the belief that people just need to get out of their environment, away from the thing that is causing them problems, into the sunshine, and be fed good food and have a peaceful setting, and that will cause the illness to go away. And probably for people who have acute mental illness, like they have anxiety or they have depression and they're overwhelmed by life, maybe that was really successful for some people. But people who had more significant mental illness, maybe they had schizophrenia or bipolar, then those were not going to be as effective treatments. And so what happened was the institutions began filling up because people were coming and they weren't leaving those because they weren't getting better. State hospitals. These were originally a place of a therapeutic environment where you were able to control all the factors in somebody's life, and you have staff that are there a lot and they're giving them lots of time, and they're able to set up treatment centers and food places so that people are trained in how to help people heal. But as more and more people began going into those hospitals, then there were a lot more people than the professionals who in these state hospitals were able to handle, and so the personal care gets lost, and it becomes more just about shuffling people from one place to another. Restraints become more of a practical way of controlling people, and so this would look like straitjackets and just high stress environments, and so a lot of people are leaving that job. So, 1940, the population in state mental institutions was nearly 500,000. Choate Mental Health there in Anna is an example of a state hospital that used to be a mental institution like what we're talking about here. The caseloads become so high that being able to really treat somebody the way that it was designed to happen becomes almost impossible. Electroconvulsive therapy is introduced during this time. We actually still use ECT. It's most effective for people who have long-term depression and they've tried everything else and it's not working, and I don't know, for some reason when you give people a level of electricity, it kind of resets the brain so that the person may be able to function in a way that they couldn't before ECT. Obviously it's controversial. You're electrocuting people, you're obviously causing damage within the body. It's just a matter of, are you creating more positives than you are negatives? During this time, lobotomies are practiced, and this was a terrible way of helping somebody with a mental illness. It's basically sticking something up their nose and severing a brain connection to, I guess that for some people it helped. That's why they continue to do tens of thousands of these until they discovered that they were creating significant brain damage for people. So positive news here. In the 1950s, new medications, I think Thorazine is discovered, and it is effective for people, especially people with schizophrenia, and it really kind of makes some of the other things that we were doing unnecessary, like putting people in cages and giving them straitjackets and other things. The National Institute of Mental Health is established, and this is about researching new ways of treating people, understanding new ways of diagnosing them, providing training for people in better ways of handling treatment and what is effective and what is not. It also gives grant money to people who are doing research in this area. In the 1950s, we begin the process of discharging thousands of patients away from the mental hospitals because it's expensive, and our ideas about what should be happening, should we be allowed to take people away from their homes, away from their families, and hold them in these state hospitals, even if they're not maybe ever being released because they never achieve a level of health that allowed them to go back. And the antipsychotic drugs begin to be created. I mentioned Thorazine earlier, but there were other ones that followed on its heels, and these allowed people to function in ways that they were unable to function out before those drugs. So what took the place of these state mental health facilities? Well, the idea was to move them to the community, although it wasn't always pre-planned, like our previous slide said, but community mental health are kind of what popped up in their place. And so these are mental health centers that are located in the community. And so we've got one, for instance, in our area, we've got one in Vienna, we've got one in Cairo, we have one in Anna, we have one in Carbondale and Marion and various places throughout our communities, and these are smaller than the state hospitals, obviously, and these were created through the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Act. Obviously, the term retardation is not used anymore, and these are centers where the person is able to get mental health services in their community. And maybe those centers even bring the services to the person's home, or in our community, many of these mental health centers have actually built and staffed homes, group homes you might call them, in which people are living with other people who are oftentimes struggling with mental illness as well. But it's not an institution. They're able to walk down the street and go to the grocery store. They're able to go to church. They're able to go to the movies, things like that. So that sounds nice, and people like that idea. It's obviously cheaper than having them in a mental hospital, but not everybody is going to be cut out for living in that sort of environment. And so that's one of the issues with deinstitutionalization, is that not everybody is high functioning enough to live outside of an institution. All right, so there are some concerns in the United States that relate to mental health care. First thing to point out is that things are better than they were in the past, right? Because of the changes that we've made, it is better to be mentally ill today than it was 60 years ago, right? But some of the changes that remain are how to provide services to people who are homeless. Many times people are homeless because they have an underlying mental illness, but I also would think that if you're homeless for a few years, then you are going to be experiencing so much stress that you are likely going to be exhibiting signs of mental illness, even if you didn't have it before you started being homeless. So changing the perception that mentally ill people are dangerous remains a challenge. And then helping people who are incarcerated but have mental illness. Maybe their mental illness led them into incarceration. Maybe they were unrelated, or maybe the person was incarcerated and that led to them having a mental illness. If you go back to one of those first slides where there was the rising stress, well, being incarcerated is an environment with lots of stress, and so if you're there for months and years, it may be that that stress causes a mental illness to kind of come out. Let's talk about homelessness, because there are a lot of people who are homeless and are also having mental health illnesses. So about 2 out of every 1,000 Americans will experience homelessness in any given night. Of those, 25% suffer from a mental illness. If you include other things like substance abuse or other alcohol abuse, then you're talking about half of the homeless adults who are having some sort of substance abuse and mental illness going on. I oftentimes wonder if maybe the homelessness causes them to have mental illness, or if the mental illness causes them to be homeless. I imagine for different people it's different things in terms of which came first. So in terms of how you would successfully help somebody who has mental illness, who is homeless, it is going to be very difficult to treat them without also providing them shelter or helping them find shelter, because being homeless is such an extremely stressful situation for most people that they are not going to be able to heal while they are still homeless. All right, let's talk about mental illness and violence. It is rare for people to be violent because of their mental health disorders. If they are, it oftentimes can be explained by a comorbid factor, which means that usually it's alcohol or perhaps methamphetamines or some other substance that's causing them to be aggressive. That is really the issue. In most violent situations that take place, say at a bar or somewhere like that, it's oftentimes alcohol is a contributing factor, not mental illness per se. So what should be done to prevent violence is unclear. Do you have the right to, say, confine someone because of their mental illness? Well, it's kind of questionable legally. Generally, you have to go before a judge, and they will take away somebody's rights to be out in the community because of mental illness, but it's usually for a pretty short time, and it's because they are either a danger to themselves or a danger to other people. But this can get kind of difficult at some points to know, like, at what point do people have the right to, say, remain mentally ill even if they're hallucinating, assuming that they're not at risk to other people. It kind of gets tricky, because it's like, well, maybe the mental illness is causing them to not be able to think clearly, so are they really consenting to being mentally ill and not receive treatment if the mental illness is causing them to be unable to make that decision rationally? All right. Unfortunately, there are way too many people who have mental illness who are in jails and prisons. People who have mental illness are 10 times more likely to be in jail than a psychiatric hospital. Wow, that's kind of a scary statistic, which means you're much more likely to end up in a jail or I guess jail than you are in a psychiatric hospital. The 3 largest psychiatric hospitals are inside jails, right? Which psychiatric hospitals have been created to treat people with mental illness. Prisons have been created to punish people, to protect the community, not to treat people with mental illness. So it's a mismatch. We have a problem in this country with recidivism in our jails and prisons. people leave the prisons and are unable to make it outside of the prisons. They're committing crimes. Something's going on where they're coming back into the prison, oftentimes after a very short time. And so the same applies to people who are mentally ill. They are pretty likely to commit another crime, which is going to bring them back into the prison system, especially if they are not being treated for their mental illness, right? Now, we said earlier it's probably not a violent crime, but it may be a property crime. They may be buying illegal drugs and they're using that and they're getting caught with that. Maybe they're dealing that. And so they're ending up back in the court systems, back in prison. So how do you deal with this? Well, there are some policies that seem to be more effective, and that is where if the people who have mental illness are going before judges and other professionals who understand mental illness a little bit better than, say, your average person involved in the justice system, then it's more likely that they are going to end up being treated, or their situation as a whole is going to be considered in terms of how you deal with that situation. So mentioned here mental health courts and assisted outpatient treatment, helping people after they leave prisons with getting treatment, encouraging them to stay on their medication, visit their therapist, things like that. How do you prevent mental illness? Our book looks at it from three perspectives: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary is going to affect the entire population. Secondary is going to zoom in on a population that is at higher risk for having mental illness. And then tertiary is for people who have had mental illness and are maybe in recovery, trying to prevent them from relapsing, going back into the hospital. Treatment approaches. The goal of treatment of mental disorders is to reduce symptoms. Right? Maybe that's kind of obvious, but if somebody has anxiety or they have depression, the goal of treatment is going to be reduce the feelings of sadness, reduce the feelings of anxiety and other symptoms that go along with that. Improving personal and social functioning, improving the person's ability to interact with their community, to work, to go to school, visit with their neighbors, being involved in various functionings. Develop and strengthen coping skills. What can the person learn to do when the feelings or the behaviors pop up? You know, for thinking about somebody with anxiety, what can they do rather than perpetually think about the issue that's making them anxious, right? So lots of different things that are, found in popular magazines like deep breathing, running, meditation, eating right, going to bed early. All those sort of things could be coping skills because they help somebody cope with feelings that they don't like or situations that are associated with their condition. Promote behaviors that make a person's life better. Maybe that would be things like eating a good breakfast, making sure they're scheduling time where they are focused on behaviors that are going to help them live better, right? So, scheduling a time to call their friends, scheduling a time to go for runs, right? I guess coping skills would maybe be better described as what the person does when their feelings are immediate. They're right there. What do you do? Are they going to kind of ruminate over them? You don't want that usually. You want somebody to do something else that's going to help them get better, reduce the amount of symptoms, severity of symptoms. Psychopharmacology is probably the most common. It's the cheapest, it's the easiest, and that is going to your doctor and receiving prescription medication for mental illness. Generally, people start with their primary medical doctor who may give medication for like depression or anxiety, but if it's a more severe mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar, they may refer the person to a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who has specific training in working with mental illness. I think they get 2 years where they're working like in a psychiatric, maybe a ward in a hospital, and so they're more specialized, and so they typically are only going to work with people who have mental illness. Other biomedical therapies, ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy. Basically, this is where electricity is sent to the brain to induce a seizure, which is going to kind of reset. I'm not actually sure how this actually works on a neurological level. I'm not sure that the experts know. They just know that for some people who don't respond to other therapies, this seems to help some of them. Ideally, it is as a last resort, because you're electrocuting someone, and you're given anesthesia, so it's in a medical environment, but it still comes with its own side effects. But for some people, it seems to make a really big difference, and maybe they get it once a year or twice a year, and it really allows them to continue to live a normal life. Psychotherapy is treatment where somebody is going to a therapist, counselor, and they are verbally communicating, and that person is helping them verbally process through what's going on. I guess it doesn't have to be verbal. You could do like art therapy or play therapy or music therapy. But there's something going on between the therapist and the counselor where they're able to kind of work through the issues, create strategies for coping with the illness. One of the most popular ones is cognitive behavioral therapy. This is an evidence-based approach. That means that there is evidence to show that it actually works, as opposed to some therapies like a Freudian style therapy where someone is laying on a couch and kind of just randomly talking about whatever, but that doesn't have much evidence to show that it works. Maybe it helps some people, but there's a lot more evidence that CBT is effective. And CBT is kind of two parts: is cognitive therapy and behavioral therapy. So it is helping somebody change the way that they're thinking about something. And so it kind of helping somebody, who maybe is seeing a spider and their brain is, oh my gosh, that spider is going to attack me. And it's helping somebody say, no, that spider is only an inch long. It is 12 feet away from me. Most spiders are not poisonous, and kind of like forcing our thoughts in one direction different from where they have traditionally been going. And so whereas behavioral therapy is going to focus on getting people to behave in a different manner, right? It is more likely to be successful in less severe cases. So people sometimes think about, should I get therapy or should I get medication? Usually both is more effective. I'm sometimes hesitant to say to people, well, just do medication, pharmacology. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, so don't take my words as medical advice here. But with medication, it may be that you never get off of that medication, and a lot of times there's side effects associated with it. But other times it's appropriate for them to be on that for the rest of their life. But psychotherapy and medication has a lot of evidence that is most effective, and so yeah, that's what it means. It's more likely to be successful in less severe cases, where the mental illness isn't dominating somebody's life, or it's not schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has not been shown to be cured, not cured, but it's not been shown therapy to be effective by itself. For that, medication is most effective, but therapy is also helpful because it helps people cope with the illness in ways that the medication isn't able to help, and helps them deal with it in other ways. Peer support. There's been more of a push recently to have people who are currently dealing with mental illness be part of the helping team that is helping people who are maybe not as far along in dealing with their mental illness. So you have somebody who is, also dealing with bipolar coming along and helping somebody who is dealing with bipolar maybe for the first time. Right? And so it helps people feel like they're not the only person, and it helps them see that other people can deal with it and they can live in a way that maybe is different from the way that they're living. And it can kind of like, it's somebody that kind of like looks and feels like you, whereas maybe the doctor and the professional staff, maybe they're like, they don't understand me, they don't know what it's like, I'm not going to come back to this place. Whereas having like a peer support who's there, it's like, oh, you get it because you're suffering with the same thing, and you've worked with these people, these doctors and social workers, and so that kind of helps people, kind of buy into the whole process. Technology. Boy, during COVID, we really implemented a lot of medical technology with Zoom, and people were suddenly available via the internet and telephone, whereas in the past they weren't maybe available for therapy, say via anything other than face-to-face treatment. So benefits of technology is that some people live far away where the closest clinic is 30 miles, and so it reduces the cost to the patients. They don't have to drive that far. And it increases privacy because no one's seeing you pull into that parking lot, and so people oftentimes are more likely to engage in treatment because they get to do so from the comfort of their own home, as opposed to a strange clinic that they may not feel like they belong there. So, self-help groups. Self-help groups are pretty amazingly effective. I think about Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's just one of the most effective organizations, and it's really low cost. You don't even have to have any professionals, so to speak, involved. It's just a group of people who get to bond and support each other, who are all kind of going through a similar type of struggle. So these are concerned members of the community who are united by a shared interest and concern or deficit. Okay, so it's not going to just include people who are suffering from this illness, but it also can include parents and spouses and other people who are concerned about the issue at large, and maybe people who are struggling with the issue specifically. Psychiatric rehabilitation. So this is a way of thinking about helping people with mental illness, not thinking about curing them, but thinking about how can you help them recover. That some people with mental illness will never be cured. They will likely have this issue for the rest of their life. But that doesn't mean that their life can't get a whole lot better and they can't be a whole lot healthier while they have it. And that's where this term of neurodiversity, and I've been seeing it a lot more over the last few years. And what it says is that people's brains are different, and we're going to think differently. And we don't have to feel like if people are different and then their thoughts are different and their brain is different, then something's wrong with them and they need to be changed. That we can have a spectrum of the way our brains operate. And yeah, so it's more like allowing people to live being a little bit different from maybe what the standard that we have traditionally held up, saying like, oh, you should be comfortable in these situations and your brain should work this way, and you know, that sort of thing. So current recovery-oriented services would include things like medication therapy, adaptive skills, changing the environment to accommodate for work at school, right? So it could be that at work, the person may not be able to work in the office, let's say, this is an example, because they have social anxiety or they have agoraphobia, which I think is the fear of leaving home. And so the business is encouraged, how can you make accommodations if you embrace the idea of neurodiversity, and not everyone is going to be able to work in the office, can you make accommodations so that person can work at home and do all the things that are required for work, but do them in a different location? All right, challenges facing mental health care in the United States. And so there are a lot of services that are needed, and there's not enough people currently to do all of those services. There's a lot of demand for social workers and other people who are able to work in the mental health field. And sometimes, many times actually, especially for people who have more significant mental illness, they need a lot of different services. They need to be going to the psychiatrist, and they need to be going to the counselor, and they need to have somebody checking up on them at home during the week. And so there's a lot of services that are needed for some individuals. Staff turnover is relatively high. This is a stressful job, and people aren't paid enough to do this. And it's also can cause people to have their own mental health struggles. And if their organization isn't giving them, like the benefit package that would allow them to visit mental health treatment on their own, then sometimes you have a high staff turnover because of that. So our system is decentralized and fragmented. That means, you've got one agency over here that does this thing that's kind of similar to this agency over here, but it's a little bit different, and the funding structure is a little bit different. So you may be able to qualify for services over here, but not for over here. But if you're able to live in this one community over here, then they kind of have more things. And so it's kind of decentralized and fragmented, and not really like as a unit and working together to make sure everyone is covered. You don't have as many licensed providers in areas that are rural and low income. I think we talked about that in maybe one of the first chapters, that rural areas tend to have less doctors per person than urban communities. So it's the same thing about licensed mental health providers. So, and then the last thing here is a lack of culturally competent providers. If you are going to be working in a community that is different from the community that, say, you grew up with or that you are familiar with, there may be some cultural differences between the way you think people should communicate, the way you are expecting people to behave, and their ideas around that. And so learning about that culture, learning what is culturally accepted, learning even how you are communicating. You're looking them in the eye, how are you talking? If there's multiple people from the family, which family member are you talking to? What are expectations around sharing people's intimate details of their life? That's all related to cultural competence. So it's oftentimes worth our time if we want to be more effective to become more culturally competent. So that is the end of this chapter.